Welcome to another episode of Thoughts and Bolts. I'm your host, Pedro Laveria, and today we are going to do a part three of our series on Prometheus and Atlas. In part one and part two, I did my best to distill as faithfully as I could the content of those two chapters. Okay. In this video, what I'm going to do is add my own personal commentary on what I read. So I'm assuming if you watch this video, you've either read those two chapters on your own or you've seen part one and part two of this series, because I'm not going to recap what I covered there. Okay. Then this is the way I'm going to do this whole series. I'm going to do two videos, one for each chapter. And then the third video is going to be a commentary on the previous two chapters. Okay. So my next video will be on chapter three, the one after that on chapter four, and then the one after that will be a commentary on chapter three and chapter four. The reason I'm doing this is because, again, I want to be faithful to the text as I distill it in the individual chapter videos. But I also realize as a human being, as Hans Gadamer explained with his idea of fusion of horizons, that when we read a book, it's not a passive experience, right? And when what we're doing is interacting with the book in such a way that what we take out of it, how we interpret it, what we understand about it, says as much about us as it does about the book, right? Jason Reza Jorjani has his own worldview, his own experiences. He distills it and tries to distill that in the book. I, with my own worldview, my own experiences, which are different than his, I read the book and in my own interpretation, understanding, right? We always create something new, right? When we read someone else's work called interpretation, right? Um, and so, every time you read a book, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, in some sense, you are holding a mirror up to yourself, to your own mind, right? Because how you react to any kind of literature or art, again, says as much about you as it does about the literature and the art. So let's continue. Now, with regards to the spectral revolution, Giorgiani talks about the spectral as in terms of a spectrum and a specter, right? A ghost, right? And what the spectral does is undermines the binaries that hold a worldview together, that hold the common world a culture shares together, right? Because all cultures are organized along binaries, right? And the spectral is always kept at bay or marginalized by different cultures in order to maintain these binaries, which keep the world in order, which make the world easier to understand. Now, when it comes to the spectral as both spectrum and specter, I couldn't help when reading the book in thinking of Baphomet, right? So Baphomet, for those who don't know, is a deity, an entity that the Knights Templar were accused of worshiping. The Knights Templar, if you don't know, if you probably saw the Da Vinci Code, was an order of warrior monks. They were monks that chaperoned pilgrims to the Holy Land from Europe, right? So that was their whole thing. You want to go to the Holy Land, you want to make your pilgrimage. Well, the roads are dangerous, right? The highways are dangerous. The Knights Templar, these warrior monks, they will, accompany you and fight for you if they have to. And in the process, the Templars became very powerful because they developed their own banking system, right? So, if you go to the Holy Land, you're going to need gold, right, in order to buy food, or, a motel or whatever. And so you can put your money in the Templar bank in Europe and then pick it up in Jerusalem through their banking system. And because of that, they became very powerful. And as the story goes, they were all killed on Friday the 13th by orders of the Pope, supposedly. But one of the charges they were charged with was this idea that they were worshiping the Baphomet, right? And then in the 1800s, a French ceremonial magician named Eliphas Levi created this image that you have right here. It was appropriated by Satanism in the 1960s and has been kind of associated with it ever since. But the Baphomet symbol predates the existence of modern Satanism, and it's part of the occult milieu, right? It's not going away. It's just part of what it is. Um, the way Eliphas Levi explained the Baphomet, in which anyone just with an eye for art can see, is that it's the Western esoteric version of the yin yang symbol, right? We've all seen the yin yang symbol. And this is the Western esoteric version of that, right? This is the yin yang for ceremonial magicians. Okay. As you can see, the figure of Baphomet is pointing up and it's pointing down, right? You have those dualities of up and down. The Baphomet is both human and animal, right? Okay, you have again the binary of the human and the animal. It's both a terrestrial animal, like a goat, and it's also a celestial animal, right? That flies. Okay, it has wings, right? So it's on the ground and it belongs to the air. And it is both male and it is both female, right? And the Baphomet, as you can see in the center, has this kind of symbol of Dionysus, the intertwining snakes. And again, hearkening again to that whole concept of duality, the unity of opposites. Um, and so when I see this image of the Baphomet, it reminds me of the spectral as both specter and spectrum, right? The Baphomet itself is an embodiment of a spectrum that goes between male, female, up, down, earth, heaven, night and day, male and female, right? And it is also a specter, right? It is this, supernatural entity. And so there's both spectrum and specter, right? So, that's my own personal spin on the spectral. And I think that the Baphomet might serve as a very useful mascot for the spectral revolution. And again, it's associated with ceremonial magic, which again harkens to, Jorjani's appeal to parapsychology and human psychic abilities and that sort of thing. I had some fun with Baphomet. I transliterated it into Hebrew rather than using Latin letters to write Baphomet. I used Hebrew letters. And when you apply the gematria, for those who don't know, Hebrew letters also function as numbers, right? So the numerical value for the word Baphomet is 137. And in looking up 137, I found a very interesting book, which I haven't read yet, but I did buy, about uh, Gustav Jung and Slowly, the physicist. So what's interesting, Carl Gustavus Jung, excuse me, and Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist. Wolfgang Pauli is one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, and Carl Jung is one of the great philosophers slash psychologists of the 20th century. He's the one that pioneered depth psychology and study of archetypes and the collective unconscious, the subconscious and conscious mind. And the two of them had a bromance essentially. They were obsessed with the intersection of consciousness and the physical world. And according to this book, they were also obsessed with the number 137 and its implications. Why? Because 137 is inverse of the uh, one of the cosmological constants, right? The fine structure constant in physics, and it's also one of the gematria. One of its gematria is the Kabbalah itself. So the Kabbalah, if you don't know, is the esoteric dimension of Judaism. It's esoteric Judaism. Okay. So what Sufism is to Islam, or what Gnosticism was to Christianity, or the Kabbalah is to Judaism, right? It's the esoteric dimension of Judaism. It's Jewish mysticism, essentially, right? And so both the Hebrew gematria for Kabbalah is And the Hebrew gematria for Baphomet is 137. And again, this one of these cosmological constants, right? One of these magic numbers in physics that captivated Wolfgang Pauli and Carl Jung. Again, I think that's very interesting, but you know, make of that what you will. Now, the UFO also serves, in my opinion, as an example of the spectral as both spectrum and specter. So if you, especially if you're one of these people that believes in the time traveler hypothesis, there are those who speculate that so-called gray aliens are our distant descendants from, let's say, 1 million years in the future. And they will, you know, point to the physiological differences between us, modern humans, and our very distant pre-human ancestors, and who are essentially, you know, pimps that walk upright constantly, right? Um, and they'll look at those differences and they'll see the trajectory of evolution from, you know, Australopithecus to modern man, and and then they'll take those same changes, right? That trajectory of evolution and postulate them into the future. And what you see is a gray alien. Now, I don't know if that theory is correct. However, with the UFO, right, the alien itself, is both a specter and reveals a spectrum, right? Because let's say if the time traveler hypothesis is correct, then there's a spectrum between, you know, pre-human hominids and post-human hominids, with us being in the middle. So all the different human species from Homo habilis to Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, and our cousins who are, you know, post Homo erectus, like Neanderthal man and the Denisovans, or Homo forensis, the tiny little hobbits that they found in Indonesia about a decade ago. You know, we are this spectrum, right? And so the UFO, it may reveal that. It reveals the human being as being in the center of the spectrum between these two poles of the ape and the alien. But also, it is a specter in the sense that the UFO, the alien, like the ghost, is something that exists on the, you know, the extreme boundaries, the extreme horizon of our worldview, and pops in every now and then, and yet is imminent and constantly affecting us. So I think that's interesting. Now, the UFO as spectrum and specter with regards to parapsychology um, forces us to grapple with paranormal, right? And especially, you know, psychic abilities like ESP, whether that be telepathy, whether that be clairvoyance, um, but especially telepathy, right? If you look at the free study, right, which is the largest study ever done on the close encounter phenomenon with, you know, more than 4,000 um, subjects, right? Uh, one thing that becomes very clear is that telepathy is very much a part of the close encounter experience, right? So, you know, out of the 4,000 people that participated in the free study, 1,000 of them claim to have received a communication from the non-human intelligence. Um, and 37% of those claimed it was via a two-way telepathy, right? So that's very statistically significant, right? Out of 4,000 close encounter experiencers, you know, 10% of them experience a two-way telepathy with the, you know, non-human intelligence. That's another example of how the alien, the UFO, acts as both specter, um, as a member of a spectrum, and also something that may possibly catalyze this spectral revolution by forcing us to grapple with the reality of ESP. I go back to the leaked Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies. These were done on the behalf of the Defense Intelligence Agency as part of the classified program known as OSAP, which was a classified UFO program, as I've talked about before on the show. This program did a lot of work at Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. Why? Because it is a UFO hotspot. So if you're going to have a UFO program, you want to study UFOs, you're going to go where the UFOs are, right? So the Uinta Basin is a UFO hotspot. And one of the studies done was a catalog of the different kinds of non-humans which were experienced on the ranch. Very interesting thing to note is that, you know, you had humanoids, right, which are described in the study as, giants, sometimes 8 feet tall, 9 feet tall, humanoid giants. And you had the ET or gray, okay? And the humanoids and the ET were associated with UFO sightings. But there was a different kind of non-human encountered, and that was the giant wolf and the bipedal wolf. In the giant wolf and the bipedal wolf, the hyena-like creatures, were never connected with a UFO sighting. Now, that's interesting for two reasons. One, uh, werewolves don't exist, okay? Bipedal wolves don't exist. This is a physiologically impossible animal, okay? And yet it was seen, right? People had an experience where they encountered it. And also the what I will call a dire wolf, right? Just a big wolf, much bigger than a dog. Bulletproof wolf, much bigger than a dog. Again, the dire wolf went extinct, tens of thousands of years ago. What both of these creatures, these beings that were encountered, or at least the mental representation of what was encountered. What they both have in common is that they're spectral in nature, right? They violate the binaries. So, for example, the dire wolf violates the binary between the present and the past, right? We have this tripartite model of time in our culture, which we have the past, we have the present, and we have the future. And they're all three are very distinct, and none of them shall ever, be swapped for each other, right? But if people are seeing in the 2000s, right, if they're encountering an animal that went extinct, tens and thousands of years ago, then that makes the difference between past and present a little, the barrier between past and present a little fuzzy, right? It creates some kind of shade of gray. Okay. And the same thing goes with the so-called bipedal wolf, right? If people are encountering, as part of this study in UFOs on the ranch, if they are encountering a bipedal wolf, then what does that do? That blurs the line between fact and fiction, right? Werewolves don't exist. They're part of monster movies. But if you see one, and if multiple people see one, and remember, it wasn't just on the ranch, it was the people on the ranch who went back home and never told their family what they were working on because it was part of a classified Pentagon program, right? And when their family members were home alone, they would see this bipedal wolf in the backyard. And not just their family members, but the friends of their family members were having encounters with the bipedal wolf in the backyard. Okay. Again, this is an impossible animal. But in having these experiences, you blur the lines between fact and fiction. And the bipedal wolf itself blurs the lines between the human and the non-human. And so these are very much spectral encounters where the spectral reveals itself as a spectrum, both temporally and biologically, but also as a specter, right? This thing that only a handful of people in this program and the owners of the ranch before have ever encountered, right? It's again, it's something just, far enough in the horizon of our experience that, we can point to people who have experienced it, but we never experience it ourselves, right? And so it's very ghost-like in that sense. And I think this speaks to some of Giorgiani's other work, where he postulates that, the UFO phenomenon is connected specifically with, the tall Nordics and their biologically engineered grays. But then there's something else, right? There's this other spectral force which is quite disturbing and quite off-putting, and can be confused for the demonic in some sense. And so I think it's very interesting because you have it right here in the OSAP data, right? You have, again, the UFO encounter being associated with humanoid giants on the one hand and gray aliens, but then you also have this other thing, this other force, right? Which is quite scary and quite transgressive in terms of transgressing the binaries we know between past and present, man and animal. Um, and then this also brings to my mind another possible motive for secrecy, right? As you can see here, if you want to pause the video, these are samples from a document. It used to be secret, but has since been released from FOIA, uh, showing some of the reasons for the government's cover up of the UFO phenomenon, mostly national security related, and how they wanted to use the media and our educational institutions to basically lie to the public for their own good regarding the UFO phenomenon. Now, what's interesting here is that when you talk about, the truth embargo on the UFO phenomenon, right? It's often talked about in terms of national security vis-a-vis, material technologies, right? Especially energy, right? So the idea is that, the UFO demonstrates anti-gravity technology, and we want to reverse engineer that anti-gravity technology so that we could use it on our enemies, to maintain our dominance, and that they're doing the same thing, right? And this is Russia, China. Supposedly, they themselves have retrieved crashed UFOs and are attempting to reverse engineer it. And they themselves have a truth embargo on their populations in order for them to develop this technology. And so the idea is that some people believe we already have anti-gravitic technology. We already have free energy. Okay, we supposedly we already have, machines, that can fit on, your dining room table, that can, power New York for 100 years, right? That's the kind of UFO lore. That's the claim a lot of people make. And, such technologies would be disruptive, right, to our economy, the energy sector, all that good stuff. But I also think that a possible reason for, hiding the truth of the UFO phenomenon is to keep something like the spectral revolution from happening, right? Again, I don't think anyone, in the 1950s, was thinking in the same way Giorgiani is thinking. But if you could, if the government were ever to say like, hey, not only are UFOs real, but abductions are real, and not only are abductions real, but the telepathic communications that happen during the abductions are also real. Now you have proof of concept that's very of a very strong psychic potential, right? So it's one thing for Uncle Sam to let the parapsychologists play with their quantum event generators and Zener cards and do these little remote viewing experiments. And yeah, they'll tap them when they'll tap the parapsychologists when they need them, like they did at SRI to create the Stargate program. But really, let the little parapsychologists who are not accepted by mainstream science, let them play with this. Whereas the real stuff, we're going to deal with it. um, you can see why that might be the case, right? Because again, as Jorjani talks about in the book, if they were ever to admit that telepathy could be at 100% accuracy, and that you could hear someone's thoughts as clearly as you hear your own, or that you can do all kinds of things, not just remote viewing, but predicting the stock market and all that kind of stuff. If that were even physically possible, because they are aware of a non-human intelligence that can do that, then that would you know catalyze a scientific revolution of the kind they probably could not contain, right? Because the last thing you want is for the drug cartels or the terrorists or whoever, to figure out that this stuff is real and trying to replicate it on their own. And that is what would happen if, you know, the reality of the pilots of the UFOs were ever to be revealed. We live in a time where the government seems to be fine post 2017, admitting that UFOs are real, but they are not coming out and talking about the pilots, right? They're not talking about what's causing the UFO phenomena. Um, which brings me to my next section here. I don't believe there's any kind of weird conspiracy theory you know, to put out the, UFO disclosure at the same time we have the trans LGBTQIA movement or anything like that. But I do believe it is a, you know, uh, very interesting synchronicity, right? Um, the UFO, as I've already explained, right, reveals both a spectrum and a specter, and in invites us to investigate the spectral, i.e., parapsychology and psychic abilities. Um, and I think it's so interesting that you have this big article in 2017 to kind of open the dam, so to speak, for mainstream people. Gave mainstream audiences the permission to talk about UFOs, um, and study UFOs in public. But just 2 years before that, you had the legalization of gay marriage in the United States, and you also had Caitlyn Jenner, appearing on the cover of Vogue or Vanity Fair, I believe it was. And again, both the UFO and the trans community represent a spectrum that undermines the strict binaries of our culture. Again, this is not a political point; it's just an observation. I don't care what you think about this, um, but I don't think that's a coincidence, right? I think that disclosure, and things like trans, and things like the telepathy tapes all coming out within just a few years of each other, um, speaks to the reality of what may come in the near future vis-a-vis the spectral revolution that Jorjani wrote about, um, in 2016. Actually, before that, because it was a PhD dissertation that got turned into a book. Now, this is an interesting quote from Jacques Vallée's journals, published journals. It's an entry from 2010, and I'll let you read it for yourself. But essentially, Kit Green, who is a MD, and he worked or does work for, either he's a CIA, he's a spook scientist essentially. Kit Green was in the CIA. I think he's out of it now, but he still does work for them essentially. And he's been, very involved in the UFO phenomenon, doing a lot of work with regards to people who have been injured, uh, vis-a-vis their contact with the UFO that's landed. Okay. And Kit Green related to Jacques Vallée that the Collins elite believes that the UFOs are demonic, and that they believe that Aleister Crowley and I'm sorry, Jack Parsons, who was the founder of JPL. So Jet Propulsion Laboratories in Pasadena, California, was founded by Jack Parsons, who was also, on top of being an engineer, a ceremonial magician. Okay. And he started the Agape Lodge of the Ordo Templi Orientis in Pasadena, California. Uh, he was under Aleister Crowley, who was he didn't found the OTO. He became the head of the OTO. Um, but basically, it's a fraternal organization, a paramasonic group dedicated to ceremonial magic. And, Parsons was a Thelemite. He was a believer in Aleister Crowley's religion of Thelema. And L. Ron Hubbard, as you know, later became the founder of Scientology. But, L. Ron Hubbard did live in Parsons, Pasadena Mansion for a while. And they were friends until, L. Ron Hubbard stole Parsons' girlfriend. Now, the interesting thing is that according to Kit Green, the Collins elite believe that the UFO phenomena, you know, came into our world post Roswell because of magical conjurings that Parsons and Hubbard were doing in the desert. Now, if you don't know who the Collins elite are, the Collins elite is this loose, unofficial uh, old boys club of super fundamentalist evangelical Protestants in the Air Force, right? At the highest levels of Air Force leadership, you have these fundamentalist evangelical Protestants who form this kind of old boys network, and they're very powerful. And they don't like the UFO subject at all. And they're part of the reason for the secrecy because they're afraid of it. Okay. They think that the UFOs are piloted by demons. Now, I kind of feel bad for these guys because look, if you have a worldview that says there is nothing supernatural, there is nothing paranormal, okay, there is no telepathy, there is no clairvoyance, there is no telekinesis unless God does it or the devil does it, right? Right? Those are their only two sources for these things. They don't believe human beings themselves can do it, right? So you have God or the devil, right? And if you have some kind of psychic miracle occurring, it only has two possible sources. And if you believe that, let's say, God doesn't do these things anymore, right? Then the only possible source for anything paranormal would be the devil, right? So if you have that rigid, binary, Manichaean worldview that sees everything as either good or bad, and there's nothing in between, there is no shade of gray, and there is no place for man within that shade of gray, then you might look at the UFO phenomena, especially what was reported vis-a-vis Skinwalker Ranch, and say, oh, well, it's all devils, right? And then you would be an anti-disclosure, okay? So I think this quote is interesting and kind of shows, if you haven't noticed by now, there's a theme in this presentation, right? Kind of a magical thing. Now let's go into Jorjani's theory of science, right? Because Parsons allows us to jump in there, right? He was both an engineer who founded Jet Propulsion Laboratories, right? And he was a ceremonial magician, right? Follower of Aleister Crowley, right? And this leads to our discussion on Jorjani's theory of science. Now, I love uh, Dr. Jorjani's leveraging of Foucault and Paul Feyerabend. Um, as you can see, what we have are different examples of either some kind of imagery, image creating technology, right? You have a photograph of a hand, you have an X-ray of a hand, you have sonar, right, which is basically sound waves bouncing off objects and coming back and giving us an image, a picture of what exists out there. You have lidar, which works on a similar principle, and with it, they've been able to find that the pre-Columbian Mayan civilization before the collapse, before the Great Collapse in the 800s, that was actually more extensive and more dense than previously thought. And then you have, of course, examples of the telescope and the microscope. And what all these things have in common is that they create a picture of the world, but they all six of these technologies create a different picture, and also they reveal something different, right? And all six of these different scopes, whether it be a telescope, microscope, lidar, sonar, X-ray, or just the standard photo, um, All six of them, right, are good for different things, right? If you want to look at bacteria, you're not going to use a telescope. You're going to use a microscope. If you want to look at the rings of Saturn, you're not going to use a microscope. You're going to use a telescope, right? If you want to see, how fast something is moving in the sky, you're going to use sonar. But you wouldn't use, well, you might use sonar to look for Mayan ruins, but LiDAR would be more effective, right? And if you want to study a human hand, take a picture of someone's hand. If you want to look at the surface, you would take a photo. But if you want to look at the skeleton, you would use an X-ray. And what I like about Jorjani's theory of science is that he looks at different scientific theories as tools, right? As different kinds of scopes for looking at the natural world, right? It would be foolish to say that because microscopes are so effective, we should never use telescopes, right? That we should only look at the world through a microscope. Or because telescopes are so effective, we should never look at anything through a microscope. That we should be pointing our telescopes, at bacteria we want to see. That would be ridiculous. That would be foolish, right? And it would be foolish to say that because X-rays can do things, a normal camera phone cannot, that we should just abandon our camera phones and only take pictures with X-rays. I mean, that would be ridiculous, right? Each one of these tools reveals a different aspect of reality. And the same is true for different scientific theories. We should never allow ourselves to think that a given theory is the one true theory, the final theory of reality. Because as he shows using Feyerabend and Foucault, that facts are theory laden, right? Different theories allow us to generate different facts. Different theories reveal different facts about the world. In the same way, different scopes reveal different facts about the world. And it shouldn't matter if two theories are mutually contradicting, as long as those theories are productive in revealing new facts or developing new technologies, right? And this brings us to chaos magic. This theory of science, or the theory of scientific theory, reminds me of the chaos magic concept of paradigm jumping, where a chaos magician will work with different magical paradigms for different tasks and will their main criterion for using a paradigm is whether or not it works. So you may find a chaos magician that works with Egyptian deities, or there will be a chaos magician with which works with who works with, you know, Schopenhauerian metaphysics of the will and representation. You may have a chaos magician that works, using, um, computational metaphysics of virtual reality in the matrix, right? Or you may have a chaos magician which even just goes full fiction and uses, the metaphysics of the Star Wars universe with the force, right? And it doesn't matter because in chaos magic nothing is true, everything is permitted, right? Assassin's Creed. And so that's what it's all about. So for the chaos magician, they'll use different metaphysical paradigms, even Kabbalah, whatever works for them to achieve a desired end, right? And that reminds me again of Jason Reza Jorjani's um, theory of scientific theories, okay? That really it doesn't matter whether the theory is objectively true because none of them are. The only thing that matters is if the scientific theory allows us to do things we could not do before. Okay. So rather than being a search for objective truth, the scientific enterprise is the search for power, for augmenting human ability so that we can ensure our survival and ensure a better life and dominance uh, the world so that we can be happy and have fun. Okay. Now, and this brings us to the issue of string theory, right? You know, the physics world, and Eric Weinstein has talked about this, and other people have talked about this, that, for decades, theoretical physicists have been trying to harmonize quantum mechanics and general relativity, right? Quantum mechanics is the science of the smallest things, and general relativity is the science of the biggest things, right? And really, quantum mechanics and general relativity conflict with each other. And that's a problem, right? Because the people who think it's a problem think that quantum mechanics is true in the same way a religious fundamentalist would think that, let's say, I don't know, Noah's Ark is literally true, right? That, all the human beings, all the different cultures and races came from, Turkey, 3,000 years ago or something like that, you know. Um, And so that's the only reason it's a problem. They say, well, quantum mechanics is true and general relativity is true, and there has to be some way to harmonize these because there's no way two true things can be in conflict. But what Jorjani is telling us is that no, there is totally a way because none of these theories are literally true, right? Quantum mechanics and general relativity also conflict with Newtonian physics, right? And we use Newtonian physics to fly to the moon, right? And it doesn't matter that these theories conflict because none of them are literally true. They're only effective. So that's what's important. Okay. So we can use quantum mechanics for, lasers, for Wi-Fi. We can use general relativity for, GPS, and studying black holes. And we can use Newtonian physics to fly to the moon. But when it comes to anti-gravity, we might have to develop a new theory that conflicts with all three, right? And the same thing with explaining psychic abilities. We may need to create a new physical theory that will explain it in such a way that will allow us to create the technologies and techniques for us to enhance these, that these theories may all be in conflict. And that's okay because the theories themselves are tools. Okay. And that brings me to quantum mechanics. I used to be so obsessed with the different interpretations of quantum mechanics, right? I wanted to know which was the right one. And I had come to, I'd gone through a journey where at one time I, believed in the von Neumann interpretation that consciousness causes collapse. At one time, I believed in the many worlds interpretation. At one time, I believe in Copenhagen. And recently I was fighting within myself between, quantum Bayesianism and the relational interpretation. But now, after reading Prometheus and Atlas, I'm at the point where I think that we need to keep all of these interpretations and use them as different lenses through which to understand the quantum world, right? And the only thing that matters is whether any of these theories can generate new facts, which will allow us to generate new technologies. And perhaps the best way to go is rather than believing that this one interpretation is correct because it solidifies your theism or it solidifies your atheism, rather than doing that, one should simply not believe in any of them, but rather use them all at the same time and see what happens. And this goes into Giorgiani's archaeofuturism, right? Giorgiani says that we don't even need to invent new theories. We can look into the past and recycle old ones, right? Or take parts of old ones, right? So there could be a probabilistic interpretation of quantum mechanics. There can be an interpretation of quantum mechanics derived from the Eddas, right? The Norse epic mythologies, right? And not just quantum mechanics for any kind of science, right? At the end of the day, the theory isn't as important as what we are able to do because of it. Okay, so I really like that. You could have an Aristotelian interpretation of quantum mechanics, right? That says that the wave function is a wave of potentiality, and that the actual quantum particle, the subatomic particle doesn't actually exist until it is actualized by something. Someone wrote a paper on that once. But the point is that we can look to the past for inspiration, right? That will, springboard us to the future. Okay. And this brings me again back to UFOs. I have been a big fan of Hal Puthoff's paper on advanced space propulsion based on vacuum engineering, because I think it uses general relativity to adequately explain how UFOs like the Tic Tac fly, right? You can explain all the different strange observables of these, you know, unhuman craft or human craft, post-human craft, whatever you want to call them, um, by simply, taking general relativity and flipping it on its head. That they're flying through some kind of Alcubierre drive or negative mass propulsion, and this would explain the different accounts of abductees, who say that well, not just abductees, but supposedly, that some of the stuff we've recovered could be 40 feet long, but you go inside and it's 400 feet long. How's that possible? How does a, a craft that's 40 feet long have an interior that's 400 feet long? Well, Puthoff, leveraging Einstein, right, explains how that can be, right? And keep in mind, this paper was published in a peer-reviewed journal, and he didn't mention UFOs at all in the paper, but has subsequently um, confessed that that is exactly what he was writing about, and that he was inspired to write this paper by studying the different accounts of abductions, right? And trying to explain how all of those can be true at the same time, all the different things that they describe. So, but going back to Jorjani, I think that general relativity can be used to explain how these fly, but perhaps they can't be used for us to fly in the same way. In other words, general relativity, Einstein's science, can be used to explain the effects of a UFO, the effects of a tic tac, but it can't be used to explain the cause. And the reason I say that is because the energy densities required for something to fly this way are literally astronomical. We're talking about the equivalent of the entire mass of Jupiter, right? For every minute of flight, let's say. Okay, that's ridiculous, right? I don't think we could ever generate that kind of thing. It boggles the mind, right? And I don't know, it seems insane to think anyone could not just generate that kind of power, but harness it and channel it. What do I know? I'm not a scientist, but perhaps there's a different theory, a theory that will conflict with Newtonian physics, that will conflict with general relativity, that will conflict with quantum mechanics, which will allow us to generate the kind of power or to get the same effects with less power. I don't know. But Giorgiani's philosophy invites us to look, okay, and not just stay pigeonholed in Einstein. Now, metaphysics. I love metaphysics. And, I will say that in terms of metaphysics, my favorites right now are Bernardo Kastrup and Arthur Schopenhauer, though I'm wavering. And the reason why I'm wavering is because I think that uh, Rajani has done something, has this work, right? This book is an invitation, uh, again, not to be pigeonholed, right? So if we accept the Kantian distinction between nomenon and phenomenon, right? That the world of the five senses is not the objective world, but and I've talked about this before on this podcast. I've talked about it ad nauseum on Twitter. But look, all you have to do is look at the different sensory organs of all the different animals on the planet, right? From bees to, tapeworms to human beings to bats to dolphins to starfish to octopuses, Um, and you'll see that they all have different sense organs, right? Different kinds of eyes, different kinds of ears, different kinds of tongues, different kinds of noses, and they all have different nervous systems, right? Right? The nervous system of an octopus is different from the nervous system of a human being, which is different from the different nervous system of a starfish, which is different from the nervous system of a bee, right? And because they have these different, sensory apparatus and data processing systems, so to speak, um, they all these different animals are going to have a completely different view of the world. Okay. And even though these different experiences of the world and experiences of reality are going to be completely different, they're all subjective, but they're all useful, right? None of them, is a one for one reflection of the objective world. They're all subjective, right? But they're useful in ensuring survival, right? Because the survival needs of a bee are different from the survival needs of a human being. The physiology is different. So on a practical level, they also inhabit different environments, right? Um, what'll kill a bee won't kill me necessarily. But yet, these are our five sense perception of the world, not just for us, but for all animals, is a useful fiction, right? And so then the question becomes, what is the objective world outside of the five senses, right? What is the objective world outside of subjectivity? Okay. So the world of experience, Kant called the phenomenal world, phenomena, and the objective world, independent of our experience, he called noumenon, right? And for Kant, the noumenon was unknowable. Um, Kastrup follows the lead of Schopenhauer and says, no, it is nominal. It is knowable through introspection, um, and also the analogy. And Kastrup, leverages the dreams of people with dissociative identity disorder to show how one mind can dissociate into multiple minds and create a world uh, that is parallel to our own, and uses that as proof of concept to argue that our own world is akin to a dream in the mind of a dissociative identity disorder sufferer, right? Which is to say that there's only one mind, and you and I are all the different alters, and this world is akin to a dream in that one mind. Now, I like that model because it's parsimonious, it's empirically adequate, and it's also, it has internal consistency, right? However, it doesn't have to be that way, right? I think what Jorjani's philosophy invites us to do is to treat the noumena as a palette, as a blank canvas, right? Imagine the noumenon as a blank canvas, and we can paint whatever we want on that canvas, right? Metaphysics, right? If Kant is right and we can't know what the noumenon is, right? And how could we, right? You know, talking monkeys, who have only been on the planet for, full 100,000 years, right? Aren't in the reality business. Okay. They're in the best guess business, right? And, you know, if the nomenon, is ultimately unknowable with certainty, you know, then what Rojani gives us is an empty canvas. Okay. And we can create whatever metaphysics we want. Okay. We don't have to be bogged down by empirical adequacy, uh, parsimony, or, internal consistency. We can literally create any kind of metaphysics we want with a catch, right? And that being is that, uh, radical pragmatism, right? This is one of my favorite quotes from a later book he wrote called Prometheism, where Jorjani says, I'm going to read this one because I love this quote so much. He says, Prometheus redefines the preconceived limits of the possible, making the putatively impossible possible by means of technological science. The Prometheus has the strength to grasp the burdens of fact that the truth is what works. The truth is what works, right? So again, this is the this is kind of like the main criterion, okay, for all metaphysical speculation and also scientific speculation, right? Does it work? Okay. So this isn't some, pop cultural, watered down pomo. Reality is whatever you imagine it to be. No, 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 no. This is much more radical than that and much more powerful. It is to say that we can concoct whatever theory we want. We can, and the theory by definition will not be objectively true. But the criterion is, does it work? Right? We use quantum mechanics not because of the mathematical elegance, not because it is the gospel truth that came down from Sinai. No, we use quantum mechanics because we can do things with it. We can make lasers, and like I said, we can have email because of quantum mechanics. We use general relativity, because it helps us with GPS, right, and other technologies. We use Newtonian physics because we can make better rockets and cannonballs, and airplanes with it, right? Um, and then there are the theories yet to be imagined or yet to be resurrected, okay, that will allow us to do even more, okay? And the same goes with metaphysics, right? The question that needs to be asked is, what can your metaphysics do? What can we do with your metaphysics that we could not before? Right? And so perhaps the true test of a metaphysical scheme is whether or not it allows us to develop new technologies and new techniques, uh, especially when it comes to psychic abilities. Okay. But what I see here is an invitation to be creative, right? Um, the truth is what works, right? So you can have any kind of metaphysics you want. You can resurrect any kind of metaphysics you want, just as long as it doesn't get you killed or ruin your life or something like that. Okay. Now, Prometheus. Prometheus bound, right? He was chained, right? He stole fire from the gods, right, and gave it to humanity. First of all, Prometheus was the creator of humanity, right? And then the gods enslaved humanity and made life horrible. And Prometheus stole fire from the gods, gave it to the humans so the humans could cook and create all kinds of craft. But then the gods punished Prometheus by chaining him to some mountain in the Caucasus and having an eagle come every day and pick out his liver, which would all grow back because he's immortal. And again, the liver is an organ that the ancients used to divine the future, right? The livers of animals, they would look into them to divine the future. So that speaks to Prometheus's, um, the what he represents as being the forethought, right? Both, and that's what all technology is about, right? It's the forethought that what's going to come next, what are we going to do in the future, right? That's what science is about. So the question I have is, anything, if anything goes, as long as it works, what is binding Prometheus today? And what I want to kind of offer is the possibility that what binds Prometheus today, okay, Prometheus is still chained, right? Or he's rechained. But what are the chains that are binding him today? And I would say it is this Aristotelian concept of principle of non-contradiction, right? Um, this idea that two contradictory ideas cannot be both true at the same time. Okay, this is the basis of, arguably, the basis of Aristotelian logic, and then is embraced in the Western mind. Of course, in the East east of Baghdad, in the Buddhist world, Hindu world, This isn't as big of a problem because you had a Buddhist philosopher named Nagarjuna who said a statement can be true, it can be false, and it can be both true and false, and it can be neither true or neither false, right? And we in America, especially, if you grew up, in the 80s and 90s like I did, we had Scantron tests and we had a lot of tests that were, you know, true or false, right? You'd have like 10 questions and it'd be true or false, right? And there was never, true or false, and then a third option, true and false, right? That was never on the option, right? Because we have this idea of this principle of non-contradiction, which is to say that um, uh, two contradictory statements cannot be both true at the same time. And I would submit that this is what is binding Prometheus today, that our inability to entertain conflicting scientific theories simultaneously, this desire to harmonize contradictory theories as opposed to creating new theories, which contradict the other theories that also work, um, that this may be, holding us back, okay, both in science and in philosophy. Now, when it comes to parapsychology, like I said, I wasn't going to do much of commentary because chapter 2 explains itself, but I would refer to anyone interested in the subject to visit the Holster Parapsychology Unit. So the University of Edinburgh has a parapsychology division. There's a lot of really cool free stuff that you can read there. I also recommend visiting the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. Yes, the University of Virginia has a parapsychology division, and it's focused on the survival hypothesis, which again, life after death, reincarnation, that kind of stuff. A lot of good free reads there. And also, Meiji University has a parapsychology division. I recommend looking up these scholars on ResearchGate and reading their work for free. And of course, in the description of this video, if you're watching on YouTube, and in the comments section, if you're watching on X, I will upload my own personal stash of CIA FOIA parapsychology materials so you can save yourself a lot of time. Thank you, President Obama, for doing a data dump in 2016 of a lot of the Stargate files. I'm sorry if this video has gone a little long. I suspect it has, but I've had a blast making it. I hoped you enjoyed it. And as always, I would like to remind you that consciousness is not classified. Do whatever it is you need to do to study consciousness, most especially your own. Okay. As long as you're not breaking the law or hurting yourself or other people, study your consciousness, explore it, learn to meditate, buy a book on remote viewing, whatever it takes. Just do that, and you'll understand more about the world and the UFO phenomenon by doing that than perhaps in any other way. Good night.